Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll have a music video from Elisa Korenne about a 19th century Native American from Minnesota called Chaska. But first, our guest and author and Concordia professor of English is Karen Babine. And Karen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We were talking before we got on the air, but first, tell the folks a little bit about yourself, your background, where you're originally from.
I come from Nevis, Minnesota, which is about 100 miles east of here in Lakes Country, and grew up there. Went to Concordia for my undergrad, bounced around the country a little bit, did a master's degree in Spokane, Washington, taught in Ohio for a while, did my PhD in Nebraska, and I've been back here for 2 years.
Okay, and you came back to be a professor at Concordia.
To teach at Concordia.
Well, with that, though, you're here to talk about your book that you've written, Water and What We Know. Well, tell us a little bit about the book, what it's about and why you wrote it.
It's a collection of essays that really look at place and identity and how the places that mean something to us form who we are. We live differently based on where we find ourselves. The knowledge that I have growing up in Hubbard County is different than my mother who grew up in southern Minnesota and my dad who grew up in California. You have different bodies of knowledge based on where you grow up.
Okay. I always make a comment about the knowledge my father passed on to me. That's another book in the writing. Can you define place for us? That's something we're going to talk about. Can you define that?
I can. And probably the best way to do it is the first part of the introduction. Is that the place I should go? Okay.
That sounds good.
So the introduction is titled, "In This Place on This Day." It's mid-May, just after the fishing opener in northern Minnesota, and I'm sitting on the couch in front of the big picture window, feet propped on an ancient ottoman, cup of tea at my elbow. It is tea time at the lake, that sacred time after afternoon naps. My grandparents who built the cabin the summer my mother was pregnant with me taught us to think in proper nouns. If my grandparents were here, my grandmother would be filling her teapot and finding the clunches, the German white sugar rock candy. But I'm alone, drinking my tea out of my grandfather's mug, the one with the violin on it. The chainsaw-carved bald eagle that was their 50th anniversary present from our family hangs on the wall, the only decoration on the knotty pine. The trees haven't quite filled in the spaces between the picture window and Third Crow-Wing Lake, but there is enough green in different shapes and textures to make me dizzy, the round birch leaves shimmering like coins in the afternoon light. Yesterday, I walked down to the lake and found several baby white pine trees, and I put a few fallen branches around them so they would not be stepped on or mowed over. "Oh," my mother exclaimed when I told her of my finds. "You found some Kermit trees." Kermit was my grandfather, a farmer by blood, vocational agriculture teacher by trade, and a conservationist at heart, gone since 2006. The land of his blood, the southwestern Minnesota prairie, settled by his grandfather in the immediate aftermath of the 1862 U.S.-Dakota War that banished the Minnesota Dakota from the state, was largely treeless. My grandmother, still alive and cracking jokes at her assisted living facility, was a history and English teacher. But she also came from farming blood and a conservationist ethic, especially when it came to trees. My grandfather would find the baby white pines and put a stake next to them to mark them. He would water them and transplant them when they got big enough. Growing up this way, I thought I knew the trees of Third Crow-Wing and the cabin fairly well, but I learned recently that the summer the cabin was built, a fire went through Bedora State Forest just to the east of here, and much of the pine that frames the cabin came from trees damaged by that fire. Third Crow-Wing continues to surprise me, reminding me that there are still more stories here in this place that I know better than anywhere else in the world than I can ever hope to know. And I enjoy the humility of knowing that the natural world does not need me to create meaning. The world here is blue, and it is green. It has been a long time since I have been able to spend extended time in this world, my life since college planting me in worlds of blue and gold, prairies and grasslands and cornfields rather than trees and lakes. But every place I have lived during those years has asked me to find the value in the specific and where I am, to find the local knowledge of how to live in that place, what makes that place unlike any other place. What does it mean to live in this place on this particular day, and what do we see when we look? Where I sit right now, I have returned to the world of water in Hubbard County, Minnesota, which boasts 90 lakes in a 10-mile radius. The loons sing me to sleep in twilight that lasts forever, and they scream me awake in the morning. As I watch the whitecaps on Third Crow-Wing, I know that this water has a relationship with the land that contains it. Last night, I watched the thunderheads roll across the lake from the west, and I hoped that the rain would be soft, not torrential, because the farmers need a good soaking rain. The soil here is sugar sand, hugely problematic when it comes to erosion, but perfect soil for potatoes and strawberries and edible beans. This summer, I will drive to Keski's U-Pick and buy flats of strawberries to freeze for the winter. I have images in my head of taking my 2-year-old niece Cora with me and laughing as she stains every inch of herself with as many strawberries as she can pick, just as my sisters and I did when we were little. I remember going out as a kid with the little old ladies of the church my father served in Nevis, gleaning potatoes for lefse in the fall. As I drive Highway 87 from the cabin toward Park Rapids, through the little town of Hubbard, the fields are already planted. The turkey manure from local turkey farms spread and tilled into the soil, the center pivot irrigation systems naked like dinosaur skeletons. There used to be signs that warned of irrigation overspray, but they have long since disappeared, about the time my middle sister learned that the signs did not say injured osprey. The idea of an ethic of place is more complicated to me than a simple land ethic. A philosophy that, in the words of Aldo Leopold, changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. Such a position statement in the literal positioning of a human being in relation to what surrounds it is important, but an ethic of place is larger and respects the larger complexities. It is made up of land and soil composition and geology, water in all its forms, history, culture, personal experience, and everything else that makes up the lens we have constructed to understand the world around us. Location is a spot on a map. Place is context, everything you bring to a location. And here's my favorite example of this. Place means more than knowledge. For example, it requires understanding that the contrast between living in Hubbard County for sand for soil and living in Fargo-Moorhead with clay. There's a difference between what the 1997 Red River flood meant for Fargo and what it meant for Grand Forks. My Air Force friend Tom's experience is another example. He had moved from Nebraska, where we had known each other, to Washington, D.C. to work at the Pentagon. I asked him about the earthquake that hit the East Coast in August 2011. As a recent transplant from the Midwest to the East Coast, he hadn't been bothered much, he said, but on Facebook and Twitter, the West Coast mocked the East Coast's strong reaction to what they considered a tiny earthquake. But the last time the Earth had moved like that at the Pentagon, a plane had crashed into the outer rings of the building. This is place.
Interesting. Was this a subject that you thought about a long time that sort of led up to you writing the book?
Looking back, yes. But at the time when I was writing these various things, I didn't think of it in that sort of way. I grew up, my grandparents lived on Third Crowing, we lived in town, and they had very specific ideas of how to live in a place. And like the Kermit trees, for every tree that fell down at their place or had to be cut down, we planted another one. And so I learned about erosion, I learned about all of those things. But where it started to make sense to me that we bond to certain places rather than others, when I came from the lakes and trees of Hubbard County to the flatness of Fargo-Moorhead for college, I remember driving back with my dad, and my blood pressure would drop when I hit Detroit Lakes and got back into the trees. And when we came back this way, hitting Detroit Lakes, the blood pressure would go back up. And I have since come to need the prairies as much as I need the forests, but it was the first time I realized that we respond differently to different places.
With that, how did place define you and influence you growing up and in your career?
I noticed very small things and took notice of things that didn't quite make sense or I didn't have a full explanation for. I learned my grandparents both came from southern Minnesota. My grandma comes from Chisago County, my grandpa comes from Chippewa County, which are very different ecosystems, and you grow different things in each of those places. When I went to Washington State after college, Eastern Washington is a really interesting place geographically and geologically. It's called the Channeled Scablands, which I didn't understand what that meant until I started doing some research just into the curiosities of it. And if you drive west from Spokane on Highway 2, which is the same Highway 2 that goes through northern Minnesota, you drive over these very weird hills. They're all strangely uniform, and there are boulders as big as houses out in the middle of nowhere with no explanation as how they got there. And the theory, which got these two geologists almost laughed out of the academy, was that it was water. That a great quantity of water had come through and basically taken all the topsoil and dumped it into Oregon. But there was no proof for it because what they realized is that that landscape looks like the ripple marks on the bottom of a lake. They couldn't prove it until we got space travel and satellites, and we could take pictures from space, and you can see those ripple marks from space.
So how does place define us?
We live differently in different places given local knowledge. So there's a difference between my dad growing up in San Diego knowing Santa Ana winds and earthquakes and riptides, and living here and knowing that you put sand in the back of your car in the winter and you have kitty litter if you get stuck. And there's a lot of things that we take for granted that we actually know that are really important about how we live in a place. And there's a difference between living in a place that has sand and doesn't erode and living in a place that has clay and doesn't drain.
Well, one of your first essays was about Chaska State Park. Why did you write about that?
Chaska's got a very special place. We went there every last day of school when I was a kid. Spent a lot of time camping there. But it's also, we take the headwaters of the Mississippi for granted sometimes without realizing the incredible tendrils that it has, especially as you go south. Over and above the fact that it's one of the most beautiful places on the planet. So.
Okay, well it is. You mentioned the flood of '97, about how it defined Grand Forks differently than Fargo. Can you explain more about that?
I think that if you look at the ways that different, and I'm strangely interested in disasters as they show up in here. There's volcanoes, there's blizzards, there's all kinds of things. But I think that there's also a difference in, the best way to say this, the difference between Fargo and Grand Forks in '97. Fargo didn't have the same sort of our dikes didn't break. Our downtown didn't catch fire. We didn't have to deal with the same sort of emotional catastrophes that kept getting piled on Grand Forks. But Grand Forks learned from the flood in a way that Fargo didn't. And so our experiences still are different.
Do some people try to escape their place and not look back, and can that actually be done?
I don't think so. I think some people would like to think it is, but I think that local knowledge is burned into our bones from a very early age. And you might leave a place behind and never go back to it to live again, but it still forms the basis of who we are and who we believe ourselves to be.
What do you try to impart or teach your students in your class at Concordia?
I try to teach them that their places are important, and most of my students come from small towns, and the first thing they say to me is nothing ever has happened here, nothing important, and I do not believe that. I'm teaching a natural disasters class right now, and they worked on a project where they had to interview people from their hometown on a disaster that had happened. And the last project that we're working on right now is looking at how we're interconnected with things and how the world is just a very cool place.
Do you find that there are good writers in young people these days? I mean, with technology, with the internet, with what's going on, talk about what you think people are writing now.
What I see in my students as writers is that they don't believe themselves to be good writers, and so nobody's ever told them that maybe they should major in English, or maybe they should take another English class, or consider the ways that writing benefits whatever career path that they've chosen. So I think that there's a disconnect between what they can do and what they've been told that they can do. And best part of my job is to tell my students that they're really good at this, and just to watch that shock on their face, and you're actually really good at this and something you should pursue. So,
well, with that said, we want you to read a couple more passages, maybe a short one right now. What have you got picked out for us?
Thought about reading the last bit of the last essay, which this piece, The Weight of Water, is about my grandpa, who is in the Coast Guard in World War II. And Grandpa didn't say much. He was a very, very quiet man. But there was an occasion where he told his Coast Guard stories. and what happens when we don't tell stories that are important to us. So this is the end of this. In one of his rare moments of storytelling, rare in that there was no prompting, my grandfather once told me about being on the edge of a monsoon. He was up on the bridge at night, 60 feet above the water line, and he sees what looks like a fire in the distance. He calls for another opinion. Yes, it is a fire. They set their course for the fire, and the seas are picking up. All the crew of the Charlottesville is ordered below decks because the waves that crash over the ship are enough to drown a man. The fire turns out to be a Japanese fishing boat, too small to be able to survive the monsoon, sending a distress signal by setting a fire on their boat to attract attention. With swells up to 30 or 40 feet, the Charlottesville launches a boat to rescue the crew. It is dark. The winds are sharp enough to whip the skin. The sea is hungry, out for blood, meat. And yet they go into swells that are as high as the bridge. When the crew is rescued and brought on deck, the captain of the Japanese boat orders his men to lie down on the deck, face down, their hands on their heads. They are expecting to be executed on the spot. Instead, the crew of the Charlottesville takes the Japanese below to feed them. The fishermen are let off at the first Japanese port they reach. After the war, the Charlottesville is decommissioned and given to the Russians, who return her when her lease is up in 1949. In 1953, she is acquired by the Japanese, who rename her Matsu, and I wonder if any of the Japanese who sail the Matsu remember that night on the Charlottesville. I wonder what stories they tell their grandchildren about how they were rescued and why they were spared, and I wonder what stories they do not tell. Joan Didion famously wrote, "We tell our stories in order to live." Tim O'Brien wrote in The Things They Carried, "Stories are for joining the past to the future. Stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for eternity, when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story." My grandfather's war stories aren't like O'Brien's war stories, and they aren't like my paternal grandfather's war stories. Kermit's war stories were not for telling. Kermit's war stories are the stories he could barely bring himself to tell, the ones that were not in search of meaning and understanding, but simply about something happening. He never editorialized, never speculated about what other people might have been thinking or feeling. His stories were things he could understand as far as he could understand them. His stories were about finding something as solid as the land he left in southwestern Minnesota, the land he understood, but the people he didn't, his way of finding what mattered and staying there. There are moments at third crowing when the wind off the water is just right, when it's impossible to tell if the sound is wind in the trees or rain in the leaves. This morning, not a leaf is moving out the big picture window to the west, the window that looks towards the lake, but I can hear something moving out there that catches me off guard, makes me wonder what it is I'm hearing. It is never quiet here, but the only birdsong I can identify, even as a born and bred Minnesotan, is a loon calls. Sometimes I don't mind that they're the only sounds I can put a face to. I don't mind that there are words beyond my hearing, stories beyond my understanding here in this place. The Japanese name for the Charlottesville, the Matsu, translates to pine tree, but the word also translates to the verb to wait. And something I didn't understand before, it slips into place, back into the spaces between the white pine needles at third crowing, to the Kermit trees, and my grandmother's voice teaching us that for every tree that fell or had to be cut down, they planted new trees. We will teach my niece and nephew their numbers by counting the rows of branches, because that is how old the tree is. We will teach them to recognize a Norway pine when they're old enough, and we will transplant those Kermit trees to a spot where they will have enough sun to grow. We will push a stake into the ground to keep each one safe, and maybe one day Cora and Henry will teach the next generation how to read the trees at third crowing.
Nice. Let's talk about some of the other essays in your book. If you got a moment here, we're going to run out of time, though. A Deadwood, for example.
Deadwood is part of what I consider kind of a trilogy in here. So there's 3 essays that look at land-based mythologies, the stories that we create in a new space to try to understand them. So the first piece, the Chaska piece, Rolled Amundsen's Teeth, is about the mythology of the North. Deadwood is about the mythology of the West, and Grain Elevator Skyline is about the mythology of the Heartlands. So Deadwood is pretty much the only one in here that's focused on my dad's family and moving from Deadwood out to California. My great-grandfather was police chief in Deadwood, and he died of tuberculosis at the age of 33. And so changing a story of a family from what you need to know to survive in Deadwood to how to survive in southern California. And contrasting the women of that family with the women of my mom's family.
And then what about Interstate 90? What does that mean to you?
Interstate 90 is a really interesting road to me because if I put one end of my life in Spokane, Washington on that road, I could take it all the way past Minnesota to where I was living in Ohio. And that one, there's that particular essay, there are pieces of music that stick to that road and make me very nostalgic for various points in my life when I was driving that road.
And then again, about Mount St. Helens you write about.
I love that volcano. That started, when I lived in Washington, I never got to see it, but I was living in Ohio when it started to rumble again. And I learned that Mount St. Helens in 1980 is the largest landslide in recorded history, which started my brain gears moving. And what are the other largest in recorded history when it comes to volcanoes? So I learned about largest lava output, largest explosion, and ash and those sorts of things. And I learned all kinds of interesting things about 1815 was a really big volcanic eruption in Indonesia, and it caused the first mass migration out of New England. We probably wouldn't have settled the Midwest without it. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein because of that volcano. So there's all of these things that have fingerprints in our lives that we might not be aware of.
Well, we talked about how earthquake can mean something different, blizzards can mean something different. Can you just comment on that for a moment? What does that mean?
Well, this morning I walked out of my apartment with a very thin jacket and regretted that when I saw the snow coming down. But we have ground blizzards here, and there's something quite magical, I think, about having a whiteout at this level and it's still sunny and you've got sun dogs. Other places don't get that, and that's pretty. Once you start to notice those details, then you can get a better idea of how to live in a place.
Yeah, I wish we had more time, but if people would like a copy of your book, where can they go?
Locally, Zambros is probably the easiest place to get that.
Okay. Well, Karen, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Stay tuned for more. And now here's the story of Chaska, a Dakota Indian who protected an imprisoned white woman for 6 weeks during the Great Minnesota Uprising of 1862. Years later, Chaska was wrongfully killed for the murder that another man with the same name committed. Here's a music video from Elisa Korenne.
We were prisoners of war. I thought I'd lost all I cared for. I was walking through hell without a way out, and you saved my life more times than I can count. I defended you then, and I'll do it again. I couldn't care less about the color of your skin. Your name should be known for your virtue to a woman, not one of your own. Chaska, my true friend, Chaska, man among men, you saved my life with no regard for a end. Then you were hanged by my people for being my friend, and in Indiana, you made my children safe in your teepee. You put yourself between the bullets and me. You sold your coat for our food. You gave me a horse when I couldn't walk from my wounds. You risked your life to keep us alive, but my people's rage wouldn't let you survive. We are alive because of you, and your reward was the white man's noose. Chaska, my true friend, Chaska, man among men, you saved my life with no regard for your end. Then you were hanged by my people for being my friend, and in Indiana, the more I spoke for you, the worse it went for you. The more I spoke of you, the less they believed. You refused to take my hand the last I saw you. You thought that I had done you wrong. The only pain in my heart knew the pain of your death. for your end. Then you were hanged by my people, being my friend. And in the end,
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Post this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funding for Minnesota Legacy programs are provided by a grant from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, and by the members of Prairie Public.